not forget to press the button again before you pull the drive.
Okay, thanks.
If you don't,
Thanks.
it won't write.
Thanks a zillion. Press the button then. Wait, okay, I'm
Yeah, so
pull
if
up.
you want to press the button again right now so you can start a clean copy, you can do that.
Okay.
Otherwise, we're going to have us talking at the beginning of it.
That's okay.
All right.
Hello. Okay, a couple issues with the technology, but I believe I got it going here. I wish I could be with you today. I don't know when you're watching this, but whenever is fine. Let me say a few words about the upcoming midterm exam that will be on Monday. There will be IDs, as I think was previously mentioned. Probably more something like do 11 out of 13 or 12 out of 14. Probably give you more than 10 how to do. Definitely have some choice. Most definitely take one or two from this particular lecture here to make it worth your time. And I'll be traveling, and I will be checking my email, however, certainly not as frequently as I do when I am here in Geneseo, and not always access to something where I can put together, let's say, a long response to a question, as most of the time what I'll have is simply my phone to respond to any email questions that you have. But if you do have any email questions, please fire away. I'll also be in my office on Monday prior to the exam, should you have any questions then. Okay. I wish I was there again today, but unfortunately something has come up that requires me to leave town for the day. And so what I'm going to talk about today is interest groups and interest groups in Congress and the impact that they have on Congress. And it's really a much broader question about the impact that interest groups have in American politics. And so I'm going to really talk about them more broadly than I do most things with regard to Congress, and more about what happens on the outside of Congress with respect to interest groups, rather than the inside of Congress. In fact, one point I can make is that when we talk about Congress, we can kind of sort of dichotomize and put the factors that are important in the topics that we cover in the course into one of two categories. One of those categories is those things that are external to Congress. So we talk about the public, we talk about interest groups. Political parties are kind of something that's both external and internal to Congress. Committees are internal to Congress. The presidency is external to Congress. So interest groups are something that are outside of Congress, but clearly impact Congress and try to shape and influence legislation, and generally for their own benefit. So so let me say what interest groups are. Interest groups are these organizations that exist and either exist primarily for a political purpose, or if they do not exist primarily for a political purpose, they perform some type of political activities. And again, by political activities, what we're generally talking about is they try to influence policy. They have preferences, they have interests, they have values. They try to get their way on something. There are some entities, some interest groups that exist solely for political purposes. So for example, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, NOW, the NRA, the American Association, well, partly American Association for Retired Persons, the NARAL, National Association for the Right to Life. So there's some groups that are out there in our society that exist solely for a political purpose. There are other entities, other organizations that exist, and their purpose is not primarily political. However, because they know that politics impacts what they do, or can impact what they do, they become politically active. So, for example, SUNY Geneseo, has a person in its staff that will periodically work as a lobbyist. He's not called a lobbyist. Generally, most lobbyists don't like being called lobbyists. Generally, they prefer names like public affairs specialist or public affairs officer or something like that, that is kind of a little vaguer in general and more less pejorative, let's say, than lobbyists. But basically, they're a lobbyist, meaning they represent some entity. Now, SUNY Geneseo does not exist for political purposes. SUNY Geneseo exists, of course, to provide quality education to its students. It's a Institute of Public Higher Education, but it sometimes is politically active. Lots of other organizations that are out there in our society also become politically active. Businesses, probably almost every business to some extent becomes in some way politically active. Some of them expend huge amounts of money on politics. Of course, there are entities that have huge amounts of money, so like Apple and Microsoft and General Motors, Alcoa, so there's these other entities that exist. Basically, they exist to make money, and that's why they're out there. But because they know that government policy can impact them, or in some way they want to impact government policy, they can become politically active. Now, they can act as an interest group themselves in the sense of Apple or Microsoft or Dell or Chrysler or Ford, lobbying Congress or lobbying the president. And so they can do that, and they do that. They will also hire lobbyists to represent them. And of course, smaller interests, operate on a smaller scale. They have less resources, and they're sort of mostly dealing maybe with local government. So, some of the businesses up on Main Street in Geneseo might periodically try to affect, Geneseo policy on zoning, on traffic, and things like that. So they're trying to impact policy. There are kind of some other entities that are out there that, really kind of represent a number of non-political actors, and they kind of do some benefits for their for the trade that they represent. So, for example, a couple years ago, when I took students to DC, we went to the Trade Association for the American Landscape Architects. They're, American landscape architects are those people who design parks and design outdoor facilities. And there are landscape architects. And so landscape architects have a trade association. And that trade association maybe tries to share information with members, with businesses that have landscape architects. But if in some way government policy is going to impact them, or in some way they want to affect government policy, they can become politically active. So there's this association that exists in DC and has a presence there. And a couple years ago when we went down there, we met with their public affairs specialist. There's a number of Geneseo Poli-Sci graduates who are in the lobbying business. When we were down in DC just a few weeks ago, we met at least two of them, Liz Allen and Tom Langford were there, but I know of a bunch of others that also work in that business in DC. In fact, in DC, there are thousands and thousands of lobbyists there, and it is a big business. Many ex-members of Congress become lobbyists. Many former staffers of Congress become lobbyists. Most lobbyists will have experience working in government. Not all, but many of them do. So Tom Langford and Liz Allen, who we met with in D.C. Liz Allen worked in the Obama White House and worked in the State Department. She's now with the group that does public affairs. Tom Langford worked on Capitol Hill as a staffer, primarily for Republican Senator Gordon Humphrey from New Hampshire. And so it's also quite common to see members of Congress leave and then go to D.C. and work in lobbying. They can make a lot of money. I mean, some of them will make millions of dollars a year, so they can really do quite well. There's some who are trying, who now there's actually now a ban in place where they cannot become lobbyists until they have been out of Congress for 1 or 2 years. Okay, I'm going to talk about different types of lobbying activity later. But now I want to talk about the issue of interest groups and their role in American politics, and particularly their role in American democracy. As some of you probably know from taking Political Science 110, American Politics, the role of interest groups in American politics has always been controversial. The Founding Fathers worried about their presence. The Founding Fathers did not call them interest group. That term was not there at that time. They referred to factions. And they expressed a number of concerns about factionalism in politics. And some of their concerns are the same as we had today. I think some of the concerns that they expressed were, we give more emphasis today, I think, than they did then. But they struggled with the role of factions in the government, or again, the role of interest groups. And I guess what that also suggests to me is that the role of interest groups in politics is always going to be controversial, particularly in a democracy. They pose a number of challenges and they pose a number of problems. Certainly, again, interest groups are not well thought of by most people in our life. And so let me say a few things about the worries that the American founding fathers had about interest groups in American politics and society. They worried about parochialism or the narrow focus that interest groups had. So they could see that there were groups then that were concerned with their own selfish interest. They could be farmers, they could be blacksmiths, they could be bankers, they could be people who lived in certain areas of the country who let's say, grew tobacco. They could be slave owners. And they were concerned about how government might affect them. And so they were very, very narrow in their focus. And so one thing that the Founding Fathers worried about is this kind of narrowness, and that these interest groups, were not concerned about the broader collective. They weren't concerned about how policy was going to impact the nation as a whole, but they were concerned about how policy would impact them. They're also then willing to sort of do what they can to get what they can, regardless of its impact on the rest of society. So if that meant utilizing more government resources, or having getting some type of benefits for construction, they were perfectly fine with that. So that was really okay and beneficial for them. And so that was kind of their sort of chief worry there, was this kind of parochialism. And that's kind of, a complaint that you hear these days as well about interest groups, that they're very narrow, that Apple only cares about policy that impacts Apple, or the NRA only cares about policy that impacts gun owners, or the Microsoft only cares about policy that impacts Microsoft, or Major League Baseball only cares about policy that impacts Major League Baseball. So there is that narrowness and focus that we hear today. Another concern that they had, a little less expressed by them than it is currently, probably a larger concern these days than it was back then, is the inequality in resources that exist. So there are some sets of societal interests that might have lots and lots and lots and lots of resources in our society, and they may be able to exercise a disproportionate amount of influence. They mentioned this in Federalist Paper number 10, but it's not a big worry, but it's certainly a bigger worry today. So, for example, my Uncle David and Uncle Charles had said they were going to spend $900 million in the 2016 electoral cycle. And so that's a lot of money. I don't got that kind of money. I'm assuming you don't got that kind of money. Are they more politically influential than you or I because they have that kind of money? So there's this inequality of resources that exists, and that can pose a problem for interest groups for politics. Some people are able to exercise more influence than others. One of our principles of democracy is that all preferences are equally weighted, that everyone's preferences count the same, be they male, female, young, old, black, white, Catholic, non-Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, resident of California, or resident of New York. Well, to the extent money, particularly money matters in politics, and money is unequally distributed, then that threatens to violate a principle of all preferences being equally weighted. So the Founding Fathers gave a little bit of attention to that. Kind of similar to that, but I'll put into a third category, is the concern that some interests may not be represented. Not only that some interested are overrepresented, but some interests may not be represented at all. And so there could be sets of societal interests that do not have any formal organization out there. On that note, I kind of also like to say that one of the concerns is that interest groups differ a lot from social movements. And so we want to distinguish between the two of them. Social movements generally have an organic quality to them. Social movements can give rise to the types of interest groups. So for example, the Civil Rights Movement gave rise to the NAACP and the Urban League and a number of other interests that represent African Americans. The Women's Movement gave rise to the National Organization for Women. The environmental movement gave rise to the Sierra Club and Greenpeace. So you can have social movements which are different than interest groups, but social movements can lead to the creation of some interest groups. Social movements generally, again, have this kind of organic quality to them in that they start at the level of the citizenry, where people become concerned about some type of issue. And so, for example, the environmental movement became prominent in American politics as people became concerned about the pollution, herbicides, pesticides, waste from the production process of companies, and that waste being put in rivers and in the air and eventually in the soil. So people, became concerned about that, and basically what, as science developed and we had technology allowing us to do some things that really in some respects were quite helpful, greater productivity in farming, farmers were able to get more plants and they could deal with insects. But then there was kind of concern, well, if you start putting that stuff in the soil to kill insects and to make the plants grow better, and then people eat that, well, what effect does that have on the consumer of the food product? Or if industry is putting toxins in the air as they manufacture steel, and if people are breathing that, then there's that concern that it can have ill effects on their health. So that led to the rise of the environmental movement, as there was these technological developments through industrialization, and then scientific evidence starting to demonstrate that some of these things, pollutants, had some ill effects on health. And then that gave rise to not only, of course, the environmental movement, but a number of interest groups that are out there. Okay, so that's a way that we're concerned about policy, and that you can have some groups there that are out there that are representing the broader public. Environmental groups would purport to represent just basically anybody, because anybody can be affected by pollution, or anybody can be affected by contaminants in food, or anybody can be affected by potentially, let's say, global warming or other types of pollutants that are out there. Now, there's a model of democracy that scholars have in political science that used to be fairly prominent. It's called pluralism, and I'm assuming that you've had that in Political Science 110, pluralism, Pluralism. Maybe I should write it down. And pluralism. And so pluralism was an interesting idea. And let me talk about what that, because it's very much connected to interest groups and the role that interest groups can play in American democracy. So I also have to kind of back up before talking about pluralism, talk about what scholars how they were conceptualizing democracy and problems that they were having with the conceptualization that they had of democracy and what they were finding empirically. That is, what they were finding when they looked at citizens and surveys and their level of knowledge. So probably the most common model that we have of democracy is thinking that citizens influence public policy, that citizens pay attention to politics, they look at different policies that they're concerned about. It could be environmental policy, could be healthcare policy, could be defense policy, could be agricultural policy, could be taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they develop preferences on these areas of policy. They may want to increase taxes, lower taxes. Maybe they want tougher standards on what factories can put into the air. Maybe they want there not to be construction of any nuclear power plants. Maybe they want there to be more testing of drugs before they're put there on the market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so citizens can, look out, at the world, and they can kind of get information about these different types of issues that are out there. And then when the time of the election occurs, they can compare the candidates, and they can support the candidate with their vote that would be likely to adopt the policy that they prefer. Okay, so that's probably a very, very common theory that we have of democracy and how we'd like to see democracy work. Probably, again, if we thought about making decisions here, in the class about, whether we were going to, I don't know, watch a film or do something, we would probably take a vote. And so we could take a vote, and there's 21 students in the class, and probably what we want is to have some sort of mechanism like majority rules. So there could be 21, maybe all 21 vote, 11 vote one way, 10 vote the other way. Well, then we do what the 11 want, and that would be sort of a mini model of democracy in action. Well, what started to concern scholars is they were finding out the following: many citizens actually did not even have preferences on some things political. They didn't really, you'd ask them in surveys. Have to deal with that later. What they thought about environmental protection, some might say they had no idea. They had no preferences. You might ask them whether, healthcare should be changed, whether the government should have a larger role. They might have no preferences. And so some people had preferences, but some people didn't have preferences. Some people not only didn't have preferences, they didn't seem to really know much about the issue. You might ask them, about the position of the candidates or the positions of the parties. And either they didn't know, or they would often misperceive the candidates and the parties' positions. They didn't know the preferences of these people. They didn't know how they had voted on bills in Congress. And so, if citizens are not really informed and citizens are not really attentive, and some of them don't vote, that kind of model of democracy where citizens, again, try to control government by forming preferences and then selecting the candidate that's closer to their own preference, it starts to fall apart. So then what emerged is this idea of pluralism. And pluralism acknowledged that many citizens are inattentive, many citizens don't participate, most citizens are maybe preoccupied with things other than politics, and thus they're not in a good position to actually have their preferences kind of implemented in government policy. And sort of was this kind of failure of citizens to perform their role as being informed and knowledgeable and attentive, and that was an important requirement of democracy. Well, pluralism kind of said, well, yeah, people do this. People are not always really attentive, but there's these groups out there, and so they can represent people. And so maybe I like guns, and guns are really important to me, and I want guns always to be available to me, and I like to have guns, and maybe again, but I don't really pay attention to politics, and maybe I don't vote, and maybe I have no idea, what the party's positions or candidates' positions are on guns in terms of regulation and availability and the types of guns that are to be available. But there's this other group out there, the NRA, and they're attentive. In a sense, without me doing anything, my preferences are represented in the political process. So, pluralism kind of said, yeah, many of the citizens, again, are not attentive, but, there's these groups out there, and they're representing citizens. And so democracy can be simply thought of as this competition or conflict of butting heads between these different groups. And so, we know that in a certain community, if, someone maybe wants to, put up some building there, some plant there, some manufacturing area there, well, there's probably going to be some citizens that are concerned, but maybe there'll also be some groups that are concerned. Maybe one of those groups is those businesses, maybe the Chamber of Commerce, maybe there's some environmental groups that are there, and so they're active on government policy. So one thing that interest groups could do is they could represent different sets of societal interest. So that was kind of debates on this went on for quite a while, there's actually, I'll say there's a little bit of truth to that idea that groups could do that. There's also not a lot of truth to it. I think interest groups can play, and sometimes do play, very important roles in democracy, and in some ways are helpful to democracy in terms of representing different societal interests, and in terms of helping citizens be involved in the political process, and some of those things that I will talk about as I work my way through this lecture. But the world is just not always so good, and in some ways the idea of pluralism just sort of seemed like the following, that you had this one model of democracy, again, that kind of fell apart because we were finding in surveys that a lot of citizens did have preferences, and we were finding they weren't really interested in politics, and they weren't really attentive, and they either were uninformed, or even worse, they were misinformed. And so this idea came, well, what about pluralism? What about that? Maybe there's cases then that democracy works that way, that these interest groups represent citizens. And so maybe we were trying to as scholars trying to sort of put a positive spin on the world. But I'd have to say, we've learned a lot about interest groups, doesn't really help us. And they do some helpful things for democracy, but they also pose a significant number of problems. So let me talk about probably the most significant problem. Again, there actually are some good things that interest groups do. So one way this model could work of pluralism in terms of democracy, and actually the nice thing about this argument is it's kind of really revealing about a number of issues with regard to interest groups in American democracy. But in order for the model to work, it has to be the case that all interests are represented, at least in terms of their proportion in size to the general public. And so we could think of interest in the society. People can have preferences on education, and what should be spent on schools, and what taxes should be, and what should be taxed, and how much something should be taxed, and how much it should be spent on defense, and a whole bunch of different things. And people, can have interest on it. And this theory of pluralism works well if every interest is represented, and more or less in proportion to its size in society. If some interests do not become organized, that's a problem. If some interests find it easier to organize for political action, that's a problem. If some interests have more resources, like money, that's a problem. Okay, so let me kind of talk a little bit about sort of why some interests may get organized and why some interests may not get organized. Okay, so there were then two theories that came out about the organization of interest groups in American society. Okay, so one of these theories was called the it's called either, I'll try to write bigger here, disturbance theory, also called equilibrium theory. And it's a very positive theory, so it really worked well with the theory of pluralism. Okay, now it's called disturbance theory for the following reason. Anytime a set of societal interests felt threatened, and that some other part of society was going to take something from them or impose some cost on them, let's say through a tax or something like that, the people that would be affected by that would become politically organized and politically active. And so they would start to do things, okay? And so that would occur. So generally in politics is about conflict. Politics is about the allocation of resources. politics is generally about, who's going to win something, who's going to get what they want, and who's not going to get what they want. So in politics, there pretty much always is conflict between these different groups. One group on one side and one group on another side. And so that kind of threat there meant that both sides would get organized. It's called equilibrium theory because if you have both sides organized and represented and politically active, there was kind of a balance there. A problem would occur if one side was organized and the other side was not organized, okay? Or one side had a disproportionate amount of resources compared to the other side, then that's a problem. But the theory kind of said, well, both groups will become organized for political activity because they will feel threatened by some policy or what one side is trying to do. And we certainly see in politics, different sides on an issue expressing threat and danger of the other side. So lately, the past couple of days, you hear, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, President Trump was talking about the unhinged, crazy, mob-like Democrats and what would happen to the country if they were to come into power. So the Democrats pose a threat, okay, to American politics. Some will talk about that if with Kavanaugh now on the Supreme Court, that what could happen is abortion could be made illegal, and then we'll go back to what they call back alley, abortions, that they'll still be done, but in very unhealthy, threatening circumstances. Or you could hear arguments that if we have gun control, pretty soon, we're in Nazi Germany where nobody has guns. Pretty soon, with gun control, every gun is taken by all Americans, and hunters don't have guns, and nobody has guns except the government has guns, and that's it. So to set aside poses some serious threat, to American life and to American well-being. And, one side will make that argument about the threat posed by the other side to try to mobilize their members, that, people will respond to that threat. So in that way, I think there's some truth to the argument, and I think you also see elements of that argument play out in American politics, and different sides try to use that in order to mobilize their members. So I think it has some truth to it. However, I also think it has limitations to it, and it may work better to explain political activity for those people who are already organized and already attentive. Okay. So there's that argument that's very positive for pluralism. There's another argument that is very interesting and has a lot of application to politics, and I'm kind of hoping that some of you have been exposed to it. It's referred to as the free rider problem, okay? And the free rider problem argues the following. It argues that the goods that are provided by government have this property of what we refer to as non-exclusivity. And what that means is that once that good is provided to the public, that people cannot be excluded from consumption of that good. The goods provided by the government are what we call public goods. Everybody can get that good then. So for example, defense. So we have defense as a good that's provided by the government. We have the military that defends us. Now, in the event that, the United States is attacked or threatened by China or Russia, we don't say, or you can't really say, okay, you paid no taxes, you don't get defense. You pay taxes, you do get defense. Or another example might be, fire protection in a community. So if somebody's house is on fire, the fire department comes to their house and puts out the fire. They don't say, well, you're somebody who didn't pay any taxes last year. You don't get fire protection there. So everybody, gets the good. No, people cannot be excluded from consumption of the good, unlike private goods. So I can have something, I can have my car. And so I own my car, and so I could say, nobody can drive my car but me. It's a private good. It has that property of exclusivity. People can be excluded from using the goods. Now, if I want to, I can let other people use my car, let them drive it someplace. It's up to me, but I can't exclude them from consumption of the good. Government goods are public goods, and so they have this property of non-exclusivity. Okay, so what the theory says, and it's a very, very powerful theory and has an application to a lot of area of politics, not only American politics, not only domestic politics, but also international politics. And so that's actually kind of one of the things we see with NATO, that some countries maybe do not pay their share of for the good, the protection that NATO supplies, and that some others then maybe provide a greater share of the burden. But the way it goes like this is that individuals, because there's this property of non-exclusivity, individuals want to be what we call free riders. They want to have government provide that good, and then once that good is there, they can get that. They believe they can get that good, but they don't have to, do anything to help provide for that good. Meaning they don't have to work to change government policy. So let me give you an example. Let's say that there was a group of people that wanted to have some basketball courts put up in Geneseo that had lights. And so they like to play basketball, and they want to play at night. And let's say we're talking to town here, we're not talking to college, although it could also apply to the college as well. But there's this group of people that play basketball, and they want to have lights put up. So what they could do is they could try to go to all the folks out there who play basketball and say, this is what we want to do. We want to get the town of Geneseo to have lights at the outdoor basketball courts. And will you come to some meetings? Will you write letters to town council people, to the mayor of Geneseo, to other people in government there? And it could be the case that then what many people do would say, well, I hope that they do get the lights, and I hope they're put up, and so basketball courts have lights because I like to play basketball, and I'll play them. But if they succeed, I can still go play. Nobody can say there, because it's a public good, they can't say, well, you can't play at this court, because you didn't help us when we were trying to pressure the government to provide this good, because it has the property of non-exclusivity. So, people might try to be, and are likely to try to be, free riders. And so they want to have the good without paying the cost of it. In this case, the cost is being politically active, and the good is, again, providing this particular type of resource for people who are there. Now, of course, if everybody's a free rider, or most people try to be a free rider, the group is going to have a big problem in getting organized. And so what some scholars point out is this is a pretty significant problem in certain situations. In some cases, there's ways that one can get over the free rider problem, but in other ways, it's really, really, really hard. So, what you could say happens with NATO is that a number of countries are kind of slackers. That they know that if Russia, were to invade them, the big countries would intervene because, it would be in their best interest to do so. And so they kind of underpay support. If Russia were to try to take over, Europe, it would be in the interest of the United States to push back Russia and to not let them do that. And so they'll kind of try to step out and sort of let this other country that has really both more resources and a greater stake in the outcome, deal with it. I'll give you. You can get these situations, when you, in living circumstances. So, for example, I lived in an apartment in grad school where, I lived with, I guess it was 4 or 5 other people. We ate communally there, and there was a problem. The problem was that some people would not clean up after themselves, and so some people, didn't like that. And it was very, very hard to deal with. And so some people, even though if everybody agreed that if the kitchen is cleaner, it's nicer and everybody likes that, but some people in the house wanted to be free riders. They wanted to let somebody else do it. Because once the kitchen is clean, they benefit by it as well as the person who cleaned the kitchen. And so it's even better if someone else cleans it, and then you get the benefit of a clean kitchen without having to do any of the work. So when you live collectively with people, there can often be these types of problems that occur that we again kind of think of as free rider problems. I mean, we have these in lots of ways. Environmental protection and littering. Everybody wants the environment to be clean, for not to be trash laying around. But people know to some extent, if they other people practice, non-littering, they still benefit, even if they litter, because their little bit of littering is not going to make that big of a difference. And so what this theory said is that some interests are going to have a very difficult time getting organized for political action, particularly sets of interests that are large. And so if the set of interests is very large, you're going to have a very difficult time organizing for political action. If the set of interests is small, they have a better chance because they can communicate and they can each understand the benefit. So let me give you an example of where it makes a difference between the size of the group in terms of whether or not they can overcome the free rider problem. So, to quote Brett Kavanaugh, I like beer. I drink beer. I used to drink beer. Still drink beer. Okay, so there's beer that's out there. So in the United States, beer can be, there's basically kind of two types of beer. If we think about where it's produced, it's domestic or foreign. So, you can buy domestically produced beer, or you can buy foreign produced beer. Now, it could be the case that the government could put a tariff, and Trump has been putting a lot of tariffs on goods. I don't know if he's been putting a tariff on beer, heaven forbid, okay? But, a tariff is basically a tax on a good that's produced abroad, okay? So if you're a consumer of beer, you would probably not like there to be a tariff, because what the tariff is going to do is going to drive up the price of that beer that's produced abroad. It's also going to drive up domestically produced beer because it's going to reduce market competition. So a tariff is going to make the price of beer that's produced abroad higher because they're putting that tax on it. And it also means that domestic producers are going to feel, less competition and less pressure to reduce the price of their beer. Okay, now let's say, just for purposes of illustration, that there were 10 domestic producers of beer in the United States. I know these days there's, feels like millions of producers of beer. But just for purposes of illustration, let's say that there were 10 producers of beer, okay? And let's say that there were, I know it's a lot more than this, 10 million, consumers of beer in the United States. And let's say that we were talking a tax, a tariff, that would basically be about $10 million, okay, if it's imposed. So if the tariff's imposed, these domestic producers would stand to get collectively $10 million, and just for purposes of illustration, let's say $1 million each, okay? So for them, they would get $1 million each if this tariff is put in play. For the consumers, if that tariff is put in play, they would each lose $1. Okay, 10 million of them, $1 per person. So for here, then, now this side has a number of huge advantages. One is it's small. It's a small group, only 10. So it's easier to coordinate action among them. Okay. The other thing is that because it's a small group, the benefit to each is large, $1 million. Here, the group is really big, so it's difficult to coordinate action. Some members of the group may not even realize there's a tariff that might be put in place. Some members of the group may think, well, I lose $1. Some members of the group may think, well, I hope these other people organize for political action and prevent the tariff from being put in place. That means that the price of beer will be cheaper for me, and I can still enjoy my beer. And if you're a Brett Kavanaugh wannabe, can still have that pleasure there in one's life, and so they can still do that. But what's probably going to happen is this group's going to find it very, very difficult to organize for political action, partly because they're going to face the free rider problem. And the free rider problem is going to be more serious for them because they are a large group. There are trade associations that represent domestic beer producers in the United States. So they already have some organization that is there. There's a political action committee that represents the beer industry in the United States and Washington, D.C. Now, what do you think a PAC would be called that represents beer distributors? Six Pack is their name. So my point is that some sets of societal interests are not going to be organized for political action. And that's a pretty significant problem. And politicians, they like policies where the benefits are concentrated and the costs are widely dispersed. Here, the benefits are concentrated among the 10 beer producers, and the additional cost that results from the tariff is widely dispersed. So the losers don't know that they are losers, okay? So there's lots of cases like this. Now, in some cases, you can get by this free rider problem. And I'm going to talk about how in cases where one might do that, okay? But my point is, again, that large sets of societal interests will not be organized and thus not be represented, or will be represented, but not really in proportion to their size in American society, and that some groups are going to find it easier to overcome the free rider problem. Okay, there's ways that the free rider problem is overcome. One is coercion. So some groups are able to overcome the free rider problem by forcing people to give. Okay, so this is actually a big issue recently, and resulting from a recent Supreme Court case as it applies to unions. There's other cases where this also applies. But one thing that some groups can do is coerce members to join, or more importantly, coerce members to give to the group. So here in SUNY Geneseo, I'm a member of the union, okay? I'm a member of the union, and as a result, 1% of my salary goes to the union, okay? I have to do that. I have no choice. That's a requirement for working here, okay? So this is what unions do. I mean, how do they get members to not just simply join, but also to give? They have to give a certain part of their salary to the union. Now, they get something back, okay? In those industries where people are unionized, there's higher wages. Some states, there's a lot of unionization of teachers. Some states, there's less unionization of teachers. In those states where there's more unionization of teachers, wages are higher for teachers. Benefits are higher for teachers. In some states, for people working in certain industries, there's unionization. Almost always, the wages are higher, the benefits are higher. So the unions do provide something to their members by engaging in collective bargaining. But what they do also is they force members to give to the union. Now, what I might like to do is be a person who says, well, I don't want to give 1% of my salary to the union, but I like it that the union gets higher wages for me and more health benefits and dental benefits and vision benefits. These are really, really good things. But I really like it if I got the benefits and I didn't have to pay the cost. That is, if I could be a free rider. Now, of course, though, if all of us try to be free riders, maybe we don't get the benefits, because the union needs those financial resources in order to lobby members of the New York State Assembly, the governor's office, and the New York State Senate. But what they do is they pass laws that require membership. In other words, you're coerced. Okay. Another example, littering. So we have laws on littering. So some people may want to litter, but prefer that nobody else litters. That way they generally get a clean environment, and they don't have to pay the cost of picking up their trash and holding it until they come to a trash can. But they would get the benefit that would be associated with that. But we have laws. In other words, we coerce people to do something. Probably this goes back before your time, I think. Yeah. So in, I believe it was 1994, baseball players went on strike, okay? Meaning their union went on strike. And so they stopped playing, okay, baseball for a period of time. And they were trying to get higher wages, just leaving aside whether or not, baseball players obviously make a good amount of money if they make it to the major leagues. I think the minimum salary is around $500,000, maybe even higher than that these days. But anyway, when they went on strike, there was a concern that some players may break the picket line. They may play anyway. And what some players said who were supportive of the union was that if those players crossed the picket line, if they started to play, once play resumed for all players, there could be consequences for them not sticking with the union and the union's policy, for them trying to free ride. And so some pitchers said that if these players who crossed the picket line came up to bat in the future, the fastballs would come in very, very high and tight. In fact, they could be hit. Or if they were a second baseman or a shortstop or a third baseman, and once they were covering a bag, that someone sliding into that bag might come in with their feet up and their spikes up, flying into them. And so they were using coercion to get people to stick with the union. So you usually need some means for it. Now, later on, we'll talk about political parties in Congress, and one thing that political parties do in Congress is they provide a solution to this free rider problem. They provide a means of collective action. We'll go into that in more detail, but it pretty much is this same problem, because it comes up in so many circumstances in politics. It's really very, very insightful. Another way some groups can get over the free rider problem is they have a charismatic leader. So somebody like a Martin Luther King, who's charismatic, can inspire other people to give to the cause and do that. So they can motivate people to give because of their charisma. And so they can do that. Yesterday, I don't know if any of you were down there, I went down to the union and was the environmental activist who does hip hop, or I'm sorry, I guess it was rap that he does. And, he's a charismatic individual, young guy there. And, he can be inspiring, maybe inspire people to give to the cause. So sometimes you can get around that with that issue, with that approach. Another way that some groups get around the free rider problem is they offer what's called selective benefits. You give some benefits to those people who will participate, and other people don't get benefits. And so that's a way of getting them to join the cause or make some contribution. So, for example, I am a member of the American Political Science Association. And so what I get for that membership is I pay for, I get some journals as a result of that membership. So that's something that I get as a result of that membership. I get those journals. When I go to a conference, I get a reduced hotel rate. And so that's something that I get as a result of my membership in the American Political Science Association. The American Association for Retired Persons, AARP, gives a number of benefits to its members. It gives them credit cards with very low interest rates. It gives them a magazine that they receive once a month. And so it's kind of a harder thing to do these days, though, because it's easier to get credit cards, and a lot of information is available online, but they still have been able to survive. Okay, so some are able to provide these selective benefits and get some groups to contribute. Okay, my point, though, again, is that the free rider problem is a significant problem, and really it's a very pessimistic insight by saying that some groups will have a very difficult time organizing for political action. And so that means that not all interests are going to be well represented in the universe of potential interests that are out there. Okay, so that introduces a lot of bias into the political system. Another bias, of course, is resources that are there. So let me talk about the resources that groups have. So there's a number of resources that interest groups can have. Some of these are very obvious, and some groups may have some of these resources or one of these resources, but not other resources. So let me talk about what the resources are that interest groups can have. One of them, of course, is very obvious, and that is money. So money is a valuable resource. Money is a valuable thing. You can do a lot of things with money. You can do a lot of things with money as an interest group, and of course you can do a lot of things with money as simply a citizen. You can do a lot of things with money in your life, okay? But interest groups can do a variety of things with money. One thing they can do with it, of course, is give it to candidates' campaigns. So that's a huge thing. So they can make contributions to candidates' campaigns. They can spend money to advertise for candidates. My Uncle David and Uncle Charles had this effort, I don't know, probably it was in the past year, in Nashville, Tennessee, the Music City. So in Nashville, Tennessee, there was a governor there. She's no longer, mayor there in Nashville, who was trying to get in place a better, improved, more robust public transportation system. And so it was like a $4 or $5 billion expenditure that she wanted Nashville to undertake in order to improve public transportation in Nashville. And David and Charles Koch are very involved in manufacture of gasoline. They're not as much involved, I guess, in the production in extracting oil from places, but once oil is extracted, they have a number of plants that take that oil and turn it into gasoline. So they like having an auto industry, or like having transportation that uses gasoline. And so they had people go to Nashville, some of their political organizations, to go door to door throughout Nashville to try to get people to vote no on the item that would be in the election, the ballot measure for funding for more public transportation, to spend more money for it, and it was defeated. And they were able to spend millions and millions of dollars for that. And so, other people couldn't do that. So they can do that. You can give money, again, to candidates' campaigns. You can advertise for candidates. You can hire lobbying organizations in Washington. So, when I was down in Washington a couple of weeks ago, one of the fellows that was there was Tom Langford, Geneseo Poli-Sci alum. He's a lobbyist. He's a gun for hire. You want him, you pay him. So it takes money, of course, to do that. And there's other lobbying organizations, that are out there. Some of which are very highly thought of, and some others that are, let's say, less highly thought of. Lobbying organizations can help their side. So if we're talking environmental organizations, they can help produce studies or information that will be beneficial to their side when those members want to meet with Congress. Some of these lobbying organizations are some of them like the NRA, the Chamber of Commerce, AFL-CIO. If you go see their buildings in D.C., you'll see their huge operations, so they have quite a bit of financial resources. They can run commercials. So you probably have seen a commercial that's on television sometime where it shows a teenager trying to buy cigarettes, and the proprietor at the convenience store points to a sign that says, you have to be 18 to purchase cigarettes. And so that ad is paid for by the tobacco industry in the United States. And what they're saying with that ad is there's no need to change laws in order to make it tougher for children to purchase cigarettes, because there are already laws in place. So it's trying to influence legislation, in the sense it's trying to keep something off the agenda. It's saying there's no problem. Of course, that requires money in order to advertise. So you can use that money to advertise, to try to shape public opinion. Another resource that could be out there is the size of your membership. So in some areas, unions are very large, and so there's a lot of the workforce could be a member of a union. And so unions will usually very much encourage their members to vote, and usually encourage your members to vote for particular candidates, a particular party, generally a Democratic Party in most parts of the United States, or maybe all parts of the United States. And in some places, not all places, they're a pretty significant force because of their size. And so that can be a very, very important resource that one might have. Some sets of interest have as a resource intensity. Their members feel very, very strongly about the issue. And so they'll vote for candidates solely on the basis of that issue. So when you look at, for example, gun control in the United States, you can think of gun owners or members of the NRA as voting for candidates solely on the basis of the candidate or party's position on gun control. They have a high level of intensity and are willing to vote on the basis of that issue and that issue only. You can think of some abortion rights groups or some right-to-life groups as also similar to that. Some groups have intensity, some have money, some have membership size. Some groups have high-skilled members. So they're well educated, knowledgeable, easy to follow politics. So doctors, lawyers, professors, other groups, other professions where people are well educated, landscape architects, et cetera, et cetera. So they have that as a resource. Some other groups, don't have that. Their members are relatively poor, less educated, and don't really have that as an important resource. Some groups, have good access to politicians or those in office. So, for example, environmental groups probably do not have good access to the White House these days. And so it's probably very tough for them to get a meeting with President Trump or President Trump's high aides. And they probably do not enjoy high access. On the other hand, when Barack Obama was president, they probably had high access. The NRA probably, feels that they have good access now to the White House, and that if their leadership would like to request a meeting with President Trump or President Trump's chief of staff or some other high-ranking officials in his administration, that they can have that meeting. Whereas when Barack Obama was president, they probably couldn't have that meeting. So different groups can have different amounts of access. A point I want to make here is that group strategy is sometimes influenced by the resources that they have. And so some groups, can use voters in what we call an outside strategy or an indirect strategy in order to influence public policy. So a group that's large and has a lot of supporters in the general public, like a union could have, might use that strategy, that it's important for them to mobilize members, and that they can do that. Or a group like the NRA may take it as very important that there's people in certain areas that will vote for candidates solely on the basis of their position on gun control, and these people will not only vote, but they will do other things to try to affect policy. On the other hand, there's some set of societal interests that basically their resource is money. They have a lot of money, they don't have large membership, they don't have intense members, but they have a lot of money. In those cases, they're more likely to try to directly contact members of Congress or the White House, or if we're talking at the state level, governors and legislatures. They're likely to have that presence in Albany or Washington, large staff, make campaign contributions. They're likely to have what we call an insider strategy, where they can, talk directly with people who make policy. Whereas those where the resources are more in the general public, they got to go indirectly in order to exercise influence. They mobilize the public, either because, again, they have a lot of people that support them and agree with them, or because they, have that intensity with their membership. Okay, let me check to make sure I got all the resources. Okay, now I want to say just a few things in closing. I also should note you're responsible for what was in the Hall and Wayman reading. I would have covered that and would have talked about that in class if I were there, but I'm not there, but you're still responsible for it. So what lobbyists try to do, again, interest groups do some good things, but you can see, I think, from what I'm saying, or I hope you can, that I think they also pose some problems for democracy. They do some representation, undoubtedly they do. There are gun owners, there are people who are opposed to abortion, there are people who are supportive of a person's right to choose on abortion, there are people who prefer for there to be stricter environmental standards, there's people who prefer for there to be more relaxed environmental standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that interest groups do provide some level of representation that is indeed very important in American society. However, I also think they introduce tremendous amounts of bias, and that they don't accurately reflect sets of societal interest, and certainly not in proportion to their size in the American public. Interest groups also, as a valuable contribution they make, they get people to participate. Like I said, I'm a member of a union. My union will probably call me up and send me emails to try to get me to vote in November. They don't really need to do that, but they will do that. Interest groups, mobilize the public to come out. They do that. They mobilize people to participate in the political process. When there's legislation occurring that's up for votes in Albany, when the budget's up for vote in the spring, usually my union will start sending me emails, as well as everybody else in the union, to try to get us to send a message to our assemblyman or state senator, and they give us a link to a website where you go there. They might even send a copy of the letter that you want to send or want to cut and paste into the members' box where they take in submissions. So they do that, and they do a lot of mobilization efforts, both at the time of the election and outside of the time of the election. Problem, though, again, is not all interests are organized, and so for some sets of societal interests, there's no organization there. So people are not mobilized to participate. I mean, my union may also try to educate me, tell me about issues, tell me about candidates, tell me about parties, and so they can provide this kind of educational function. I get a mailing from my union, I don't know, once a month or once every other month with information in it. So they do that. But again, of course, those individuals who have no organization that's there representing them, are likely to be, not have that information. My interest group, my union, it will monitor policy. It will monitor policy on SUNY. So one thing that interest groups do is they can kind of monitor policy and see how well it's working. I'm not maybe keeping an eye on everything that's going on, and maybe I care about the environment, and I'm not really attentive to all these policies. But maybe the Sierra Club is, and they really are following things more closely. So they have people that they've hired, that have technical expertise, and that's all they're doing, is following government policy on toxins that are out there. And so they're actually really doing a very, very valuable thing that way. So that's good, but again, not all interest groups have organization attached to them. Let me see where I want to go here. And let me just say a couple things about the Hall and Wayman article, and then we will end, not quite the all amount of time, but close to the amount of time that we have. The Hall and Wayman article is, of course, concerned with the influence of money in politics. It's actually very hard to study the effect of money in politics. And we sort of think, of course, those citizens or those entities with lots of money, many of which, like my Uncle David and Uncle Charles, are primarily concerned with making lots of money, are probably wise in their expenditure of money. And so are spending money to help themselves make more money. And that's what you could certainly argue that the Koch brothers do. However, that's an argument and that's not proof. And so it's very hard to actually show that money influences the votes of members of Congress. But it has been relatively easy to show that money influences members of Congress's participation in committee. So we talked about hearings and we talked about markupping in committee and the importance of those processes. And generally what you find is that those members who receive money from certain societal interests are very, very active on behalf of those sets of societal interests. So I do think there are ways in which money is very influential. So I'm going to go turn this off. I hope this worked. I hope I don't have to do it again. I've talked for a while. I tried it yesterday, had a little bit of difficulty, and I wish you good luck in your preparation and for the exam.